Welcome back from a good lunch. There is still a lot of knowledge to be learned, so it's a pleasure for me to welcome you all to this next session named Russia Beyond Moscow. This is, of course, a very small topic, very easy to cover in 1 hour, so please be patient with us, and we will try to stay disciplined and cover a couple of topics, but of course it's impossible to tell everything. With us today, my name is Helene Skjeggestad. I'm a journalist with the Norwegian newspaper Aftenposten. From this summer, I will be based in Moscow as a new correspondent. So this day has been very informative and very, very interesting. With us today to cover the whole of Russia, except for Moscow, is Dr. Ekaterina Sokirianskaia. You are the founder and director of Conflict Analysis and Prevention Center, and you aim to provide nuanced and accurate field-based analysis of violent conflicts in Russia and post-Soviet space. And of course, welcome again once Maxim Trudolyubov. We got to know you in the first panel, but I would just repeat that you are editor-at-large at Vedomosti and a senior fellow with the Kennan Institute, and you have been following Russian economy and politics since the late 1990s. So please, Ekaterina, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me, and thanks for this very inspiring event. I will focus today, of course, this is a very huge topic we're trying to cover, but I will focus on the North Caucasus, the region which played a very important role in shaping Vladimir Putin's time in office. As we all remember, Vladimir Putin came to power in the wave of the Second Chechen War. He did use terrorism as a reason and pretext to curb freedoms. Many practices have first been tested in the North Caucasus and then transferred to other regions. So I think it's worth spending some time analyzing this part of Russia. Let me first give you a little background to those who are not very familiar with this part of the world. North Caucasus consists of 6 national republics and a mostly Russian populated Stavropol Krai. The region is small compared to other parts of Russia with a population around 10 million, but very diverse. It's predominantly Muslim, but ethnically very diverse. It is a home to dozens of national and ethnic groups who have strong cultures, identities, different aspirations, often complicated or very complicated history of colonization and integration in the Russian state and relations with the center and with their neighbors. Apart from cultural differences, there are several security-related challenges associated with this region. Most importantly, the protracted armed conflict, the still remaining unresolved problem of Chechnya, and ethnic conflicts and tensions. At least these are the 3 that I have the scope to focus on. The Kremlin has claimed to solve all of these problems at this point, and let me briefly explain how. For 2 decades after the collapse of the North Caucasus has been extremely volatile. Well, actually, since the collapse of the USSR, it's been home to one of the most deadly conflicts in Europe, in Chechnya. It has lived through 2 very violent wars in Chechnya, starting from '94. The separatist conflict gradually transformed into a region-wide guerrilla insurgency driven by jihadi ideology by 2007. The violence from Chechnya spilled over to the entire region, but most notably to the neighboring Dagestan. Things changed, however, a few years ago. Since 2014, roughly, the region has seen remarkable reduction in violence. The numbers of casualties have sharply gone down. This decline was partly related to the insurgency's internal decline, but mostly to the mass exodus of North Caucasian radicals to Syria and Iraq. This exodus was to a significant extent facilitated by security services, who months before the Sochi Olympics in the winter 2014 carried out massive crackdown both on the insurgent networks and on non-violent Salafi communities across the region. And at the same time, they closed eyes on the mass departures of radicals to Syria and Iraq. The local police and regional experts clearly tell us directly that, police clearly tell us that between 2012 and 14, they gave green light, as we say in Russian, to those who wanted to go to Syria, thus exporting nearly the entire radical agency to the Middle East. According to the Russian Interior Ministry, 3,417 Russian citizens fought in ISIS in 2016. This is the last precise figure we have, with many others also fighting in non-ISIS groups. According to Sufan Group, as of October 2017, Russian citizens were the largest contingent of foreign fighters in Syria and Iraq. And in the past several years, Russian militant jihadists have been involved in suicide attacks in the Philippines, in Turkey in 2016, suicide attacks in Mosul, have played a key role in the Syrian civil war, rising to the upper echelons of ISIS military. The regional insurgency in the North Caucasus as well rebranded, and since 2015 they're committing attacks in Russia as well under the banners of ISIS. The number of attacks has significantly reduced, though. In 2018, we have so far only 32 people killed or injured in clashes in Chechnya, which is really small compared to just a few years ago. So this is seen by the regional law enforcement as a pragmatic approach. They say, well, everybody's happy, I quote, "They're dying on the way of Allah, and we don't have terrorists here. And now we're bombing them in Syria." So at the same time, this has been, it has brought feasible, clear results. But at the same time, the North Caucasus insurgency became an integral part of the global jihadi landscape and continued to threaten Russians from the outside, although recently the Ministry of Defense announced that 4,500 jihadists from the former USSR were killed in the Russian military campaign in Syria. Another challenge, if we talk about security, is Chechnya, which today is a state within a state, with its own well-trained security forces, its own parallel informal system of economy, own system of regulations and laws, and to an extent its own foreign policy. From the point of view of the Kremlin, the problem of Chechnya is solved as well. Chechnya has defeated insurgency, it restored infrastructure, it has super loyal young leader who brings hundreds of thousands of cheerful demonstrators in the squares of Grozny to celebrate Russian national holidays, whose formless separatists, volunteers have fought for the Russian cause in the Ukraine, and well-trained military police is now serving in Syria. Chechnya looks great if you look at the footage, more like Dubai than a provincial Russian capital. But behind this facade is truly grim reality. After 18 years of restoring constitutional order, it has turned into the worst totalitarian enclave in Europe and ruled by the orders of a 41-year-old dictator, which have very little to do with Russian laws, Chechen traditions, or anything. There are no mechanisms for protection of Chechen residents. None of the state agencies will ever dare to investigate crimes committed by people affiliated with the local authorities. Any critic will be cruelly mistreated and forced to publicly apologize on television. There exists a system of secret prisons where dozens and sometimes hundreds of people are kept for weeks, sometimes incommunicado, without registration, subjected to routine torture and beatings. Torture is used in investigating nearly any type of crime, from petty to serious. Just law enforcement don't trust any other testimony unless it's provided under torture. Human rights defenders are openly equal to terrorists. Just recently, Ramzan Kadyrov said that after the end of the trial of Ayub Titiev, they will not be allowed on the Chechen territory. Their offices have been burned. Marijuana was planted in the memorial office. They are thrown to jail, as we know, killed or intimidated. The trial of our friend and colleague Ayub Titiev, the head of Memorial in Chechnya, is the most brazen and cynical process in today's Russia. There's a powerful personality cult of Kadyrov in Chechnya, who is officially nearly referred to as Padishah, and everyone has to praise him. So is this a sustainable solution? This is a solution, yeah. That's what the Kremlin is offering us. Is it sustainable? Well, Kadyrov is young and can continue for very long. But of course, it's a very extremely personalized setup, depending on Putin-Kadyrov personal bond. It is not transferable to anybody else, and it's unlikely to survive longer than Putin is in power. Another regional specificity is a host of unresolved ethnic conflicts and tensions that are not often ethnic per se, but they are a result of arbitrarily drawn and redrawn borders, land disputes, which have been emerging during years of colonialism in the Soviet times, competition for power, resources, and some other region-specific factors. These conflicts have also been taken under control to a great extent. The national movements, which were extremely powerful in the 1990s, have been partly crushed. Partly their leaders radicalized, joined regional conflicts and were killed. Partly they were successfully incorporated into the Republican political establishments, and they are now part of the authorities. For years, the ethnic agenda was hijacked by great interest in Islam and Islamism, but it is getting back. It is getting back on the scene across the region. We see ethnic mobilization crystallizing again. In some regions, this becomes more visible, like in Ingushetia recently, or in Kabardino-Balkaria, where there was a clash between Kabardins and Balkars recently. In others, it is still in a more latent fashion. The region does look quiet and stabilized from this point of view, but all problems are still there. None of them has been resolved. They are frozen, and the resolution is postponed for later days. Apart from regionally specific issues that I've mentioned, North Caucasus shares most of Russia's social and political problems, which, however, acquire more intense and even dramatic form in this part of Russia. The population in some republics also have different strategies of coping with similar challenges by basically solving the problem on their own and making the Russian state institutions increasingly irrelevant. For example, in the North Caucasus, like more than in any part of Russia, it suffers from an acute deficit of democratic procedure and accountability. The North Caucasus republics are often referred to as electoral sultanates because they produce very high results for the ruling party and for the Russian president during elections. Apart from certain exceptions at the level of village administration, there have been no free and fair elections for many, many years in this region. As a consequence, the estrangement of the population and the Republican elites, who are not accountable in any way to the constituencies but implement the directives of the federal center, has reached unprecedented levels in most of the republics. And this lack of accountability leads to immense corruption and the capture of the state institutions by informal networks and criminal clans that in Dagestan, for example, for many years had direct links with the jihadist insurgency, and they committed jihadi groups to kill and threaten opponents or rivals. The quality of governance as a result is such that in some places it approximates the conditions of a failed state, which creates deep distrust of the state institutions. This also happens in other parts of Russia as well, but in the North Caucasus, the communities do what other regions don't. They resort to informal social institutions to solve their daily problems. For example, in some villages of Dagestan, waste management, installing gas pipes, electricity wiring, and roads are managed by local Islamic village divans or councils rather than government administrations. In one village, for example, I was told that the residents themselves collectively bought a second-hand fire truck to protect themselves from possible fires. So the state becomes a kind of external superfluous burden rather than a service provider. Corruption and political dependence of courts, which is, again, countrywide problem, in the North Caucasus boosts the importance of alternative justice, which is in the North Caucasus context is either customary law or the Sharia law, especially in resolving family and commercial disputes. The very notion of secular law and secular state has been significantly discredited, especially with the religious youth, many of whom perceive the secular state as oppressive and illegitimate. As a result of the prominence of alternative legal system has grown very significantly, which again pushes the Russian state out of this social niche as well. And of course, human rights violations. They are a problem across Russia, but brutality of security services in this region is more egregious. Many things have started in Chechnya, as Elena mentioned, and then were spilled over to other parts of Russia. 3,000 to 5,000 people went missing in Chechnya after detentions by security services, only in Chechnya. Today, torture, summary executions, abductions regularly occur throughout the region, although the authorities outside Chechnya have managed to largely stop enforced disappearances. They've been nearly curbed. This doesn't happen anymore. Apart from a handful exceptions, no one has been accountable for any of these systemic grave violations. And these are quite frustrating conditions. And people normally, these frustrating conditions are conducive to search for political alternatives. And in central Russia, the alternative is to replace government. There's no alternative vision of statehood. Then in the North Caucasus, there is. And that's why the recruiters of radical networks have been able to successfully market the ideas of the Islamic State, of the Islamic Caliphate, of the Islamic rule. The local authorities, of course, fight with these ideas, with the jihadist ideals, by promoting, and in case of Chechnya, enforcing traditional Sufi Islam, which is the official, more soft version of Islam supported by the states. But this way, the secular space shrinks dramatically. The young people are really interested in religion, but in Chechnya, for example, there's such an overwhelming influence of Islam in the public space that the secular nature of the state is nearly eroded. Sufi Islam is everywhere. It's on television, it's on social media, it's at the workplace, in the universities, at school. It's the key issue that is being contested politically. The Chechen authorities impose dress codes, they dole out savage punishments for sale or consumption of alcohol, and support morality policing by state and non-state actors who try to catch young people who engage in non-Islamic behavior, threaten them, and harass them. Dagestan is also a very conservative republic. It is more open and diverse in respect of religion, but similar tendencies are present there. For example, just a few days ago, an anime festival was crashed in Dagestan by the conservative radicals previously, and people were delivered to police stations with links to the state, right? Previously, rap musicians were threatened, and one had to cancel his concert in Makhachkala, and police has to protect, for example, Christmas trees before New Year, nearly every year in urban places. So how do young people react to all of this? Part of young generation learns quickly that to be successful, you have to take very simple steps. You have to be loyal to the incumbent elites, and you have to serve their interests and try to go up. But those who resent this path, they feel that there's very little alternative. There used to be quite a vibrant civil society in the North Caucasus, but now it's very hard for it to offer a third way. This once vibrant civil society has been very significantly weakened, especially in Chechnya, of course. And interestingly, that across the North Caucasus and probably across Russia as well, young people are losing trust with the older generation. As one of the English practitioners who works a lot with youth, she's doing conflict resolution and human rights training, she told me that kids, the teenagers, the young people, they don't trust adults anymore as a generation. This generation of adults has lied and pretended to them too much, and she used the expression "изолгавшиеся взрослые," yes, the adults who have lied too much. And she says that every time when we have to get into the classroom, we have to overcome this distrust as being seen as the representatives of this generation. But the good news is that the social movements that Misha Gabovich was describing this morning, they are emerging in the North Caucasus as well, particularly in bigger cities, especially in Makhachkala. And this is a great news. Chechnya, of course, is much more depressing. There's no space for independent civil society. And the lack of trust in anybody is combined, with our own parents sometimes, is combined with the traumas and memories of war, which is still extremely powerful. The Chechen conflict has never been resolved in earnest. The reconciliation has not even started. No one has worked with these war traumas that continue to affect the new generations. As one of my interviews recently noted, you come into the village and there, all conversations are still about war. Everybody blames their personal problems on war. Kadyrov propaganda is also uses war. If it's not us, there will be war, they're saying. The war was over only due to my family. And this affects very powerfully the fragile psychic of the children. And I will quote from what she said: "Imagine when the entire social space around you is absorbed with mythical heroes, heroes who died as martyrs, who went missing, who fought with the Russians for Islam. And when there's so many examples around of martyrdom and death, it affects young people very strongly. And this is what makes readiness of death easy." Radicals manipulate this. They say these people have sold their soul to infidels when they talk about the authorities. They have killed our fathers, and you're still sitting here and doing nothing. As a result, the sporadic attacks which still do occur are being committed by visibly younger insurgents. Already in December 2016 and January 17, Novaya Gazeta, I think Lena reported that dozens of young people under 18 were detained as suspects. In August 2018, there was a series of attacks on police carried out in Grozny by teenagers aged 11 to 17. And subsequently, around 200 teenagers were reportedly apprehended by the police. The family members of these killed teenagers, the insurgent teenagers, were reportedly expelled from Chechnya. Ramzan Kadyrov ordered the security services to establish total control, what he said, total control over the Chechen school children. And this combination of harsh governmental measures and effective ideological indoctrination by the radical groups is likely to even further engage very young people into this conflict. This is a new post-war generation of teenagers who haven't seen or don't remember the war, but they grew up in the families which are deeply traumatized by the war. They immersed in this totalitarian environment, and they feel immense pressure of their families, of their children, of police, of their parents. And this new generation is also the product of Putinism that we're discussing today. Just as is Chechnya. We shouldn't forget that Kadyrov regime has been installed and kept there by force. It is armed, financed, and guaranteed security by the Kremlin. And the Kremlin finds this model in Chechnya very successful. On one occasion, even Putin advised Poroshenko to solve the problems of Donbass like Russia did with Chechnya, buy them with money and sovereignty. And I think we can even maybe seeing or recognizing the familiar features of this, familiar features in the conflict, in the Kremlin-led post-conflict transition of Syria, which is being proposed today, right? Conflict resolution by means of massive military force, trying to push refugees back, electoral process under conditions of fear, and then keeping Bashar Assad in power with full impunity and the protection of the Russian military bases. This is, of course, still very hypothetical, but quite possible scenario for exporting some of our domestic know-hows abroad. Thank you.
Hello again. I'm sorry to take the floor for the second time today. It wasn't actually by design, it's by accident. I am right now a stand-in for someone couldn't make it to the conference here, and it's Helena Nemirovskaya, who's a very important figure in the Russian civil society. She's with her husband Yuri Sinakosov, the founder of Moscow School of Civic Education, which was created in the early 90s, and is a really venerable and important NGO in Russia that's been around for so long, and which actually served as an example for many people and organizations that been created, developed, closed down, opened up again throughout these years. So she asked me, she was supposed to speak here, she basically asked me to take this time instead of her and sort of say things that she was supposed to say, plus add whatever she said whatever I like, so I will do that happily for her. But basically, it's about what I'm saying is kind of, and and I'm. She asked me because I'm part of the how it's called. It's the board. It's one of the two boards, but the board of supervising kind of board of the school, mostly responsible for the academic part of the program, the things that they discuss and do throughout their yearly programs. So that said, I will say kind of three. I will make 3 points. So I will briefly tell about the school. I will then move to the regional breakdown and speak a little bit about how Russia looks from the point of everything that's beyond Moscow. And then I'll kind of conclude on comparing Moscow and non-Moscow, because it's actually a very, very important story when you're in Russia. It's actually this story in a way, because everyone who lives outside of Moscow is kind of looks at Moscow as the pole of politics, economics, social life, everything. So the school of used to be called created in 93, 94. Used to be called Moscow School of Political Studies, then renamed 4 or 5 years ago as Civic Education. But essentially what it was doing throughout all those years was teaching civics and bringing Russia's most important and influential lecturers, commentators, scholars, scientists, politicians to speak at seminars. They organize seminars. What they do essentially is that they bring people from throughout Russia into programs that usually run for about a week, less than a week, 5 days usually, highly packed with speakers and discussions and roundtables. And that proved an incredibly influential model. We didn't have anything like that back in the early 90s. And because of the quality of the speakers, apparently, it was very kind of a popular and important platform. And they've always concentrated on bringing people as listeners, as people who would attend the classes from Russia rather than Moscow. The thinking being that in Moscow, I mean, I'm from Moscow myself. I mean, Moscow is a kind of a cosmopolitan, post-industrial, rich, and with the libraries, the media, everything, you have access. In Russia, you don't have access to information, a lot less usually, and you want to be part of the crowd, etc., etc. So they've been doing this for years and years, and by now more than 20,000 people went through the system, and many of them became politicians. Many of them were journalists, still are journalists. And many of them moved on to be part of the Kremlin system. Many of them remained sort of neutral, or some are in opposition. So it's not like a place that teaches people to oppose the regime, but it essentially teaches people all things civics, which is important because in Russia we don't have properly really a civics kind of classes. I think they do have it now in schools, but it's obviously it's very influenced ideologically. But historically, it's a number of subjects that really have not been discussed properly. And obviously, especially in the 90s, when you are in a situation where you are the early post-Soviet period, where everything people know comes from Soviet textbooks and teachers who were teaching, scientific communism, and the history of the party. So whatever it was about social life and civics would come at the time, especially from the people who were communist functionaries and scholars who were teaching Marxism, Leninism in universities, and so you needed to bring a different perspective, and that's what the school has been doing for years and years. And so it sort of created a following, and there are lots of people throughout Russia who went through the school, and they're doing all kinds of different things, running some of them interesting grassroots projects, various media projects, and so this is what school's been doing. The situation with it right now is that 4 years ago, as many NGOs in Russia, it was officially labeled foreign agent. We have this legislation passed by the State Duma that essentially is designed to see what NGOs are funded by foreign foundations, and whatever organization is funded by a foreign foundation is almost all of them by now are labeled foreign agents. And in Russia, it doesn't ring like nice, this kind of thing. It doesn't prohibit you from doing things actually, officially, but it really makes life harder and harder. You have to produce a lot of paperwork, and you're constantly supervised. But what's even worse is that basically it doesn't really, it doesn't help people, especially from the region, to come and be part of the program, because their local bosses or their colleagues or whoever it is back there would ask them, what are you doing, why you're going there, and if they know that it's a foreign agent or organization, it doesn't. Many of them just stop doing this because it doesn't. It may cause problems, and people get fired, for example. It's not like, we live in a very kind of age of. It doesn't create a repression, but it does create a lot of problems. Basically, right now, this is the situation the school is under. It continues working, but it's difficult with all the difficulties that's created by this. I think unwise legislation, because the school does not really aim at any kind of specifically addressing the regime in any way. It's as I say, teaching, discussing civics. Point 2, the regions, and so the center of Moscow School of Civic Education has always been outside of Moscow, the focus outside of Moscow, and Russia's regions are extremely diverse, and by one measure recently, it's a World Bank report. I think it was called the New Social Contract for Russia, measuring the inequalities between regions, and it's like the third worst in Europe. And the differences between, they give an example, for example, the Sakhalin, which is an island on the easternmost part of Russia, the incomes, GDP and incomes, roughly equal those in Singapore, whereas in Ingushetia, one of the Caucasus regions, it's like in Honduras. And differences between some of the top regions, top income regions, and like the worst regions could reach like 20 times. it's a huge, huge disparity. I would bring up an example that's a very well-known and probably the most important scholar in Russia who's studying regions and regional arrangements in Russia, Natalia Zubarevich, and she has compared Russia's regions, or Russia itself, to a dinosaur. So you would have a small head with 3 to 5 very rich regions that would include Moscow, Tyumen, Sakhalin, and arguably maybe Moscow Oblast, the Moscow region too. These are the two different regions, Moscow Oblast. Then you would have 10 to 12 highly developed regions like Tatarstan, Krasnoyarsky Krai, and such. And they are highly developed, relatively high income regions. And then you have 2/3 of Russia's regions, like as a big body in the middle, which are underdeveloped, usually low income. And then a long tail of so-called national republics, which is essentially Caucasus and some regions like the Altai, the Altai mountainous region, which are low income. So again, so disparity is huge. The opportunities for people are highly different. So, as I said, there are actually very few countries with this kind of inequality between regions. Very few countries in the world. You could compare it to probably places like China or Brazil, and Russia would probably fare even worse in that sense, because inequality between Moscow or Tyumen in terms of incomes and the lowest is like enormous, and this creates a kind of the drama. It creates the scene on which everything sort of unfolds. And the interesting development, I would just go into this as an example, this new political story that we have in Russia right now that concerns the regions, and it's all about regions rather than Moscow, is the recent round of elections that Russia holds every year in September. And this last September, 23 regions had elections for the governorships were sort of contested, not really contested. But the interesting result was that 4 regions at least, there were also some mayoral elections which were also interesting, but in 4 regions at least, the people failed to vote for the designated candidate. The candidate who promoted by the Kremlin. And promoted meaning basically saying that this is the candidate, this is the only guy who has to win. And people essentially refused to play by this well-known game. Like everybody in every region knows what they have to do. It's not like it's like a news. It's been around for more than 20 years now. You basically go and vote for the right person. And they voted for the wrong person. All the other candidates were not supposed to win. The system works like basically they are trained to be these kind of spoilers, stand-ins, whatever you call this, understudies if it's like compare it to a theater. So basically, the lead roles are the people you have to choose, and the understudies are basically just show that they represent the diversity. But people voted for these understudies just to show, they understand that it doesn't make much difference actually, because the Kremlin will continue to run their region. It was just a show. We vote for a different guy. It was a man in each of the regions. Anyway, so it showed kind of a new situation. The regions became some regions, most of them in the Far East, Primorye-Khabarovsky Krai were the most important, and Primorye is the region, Primorsky Krai is the kind of the easternmost region of Russia with a center in Vladivostok. It proved the biggest headache for the Kremlin. They still have a rerun in December because the voters there refused to vote for the designated guy from Moscow, and now Moscow sent them a new guy from a neighboring region who's supposedly an insider, who they hate too. And now the drama is basically that the Kremlin's been essentially eliminating everybody who could possibly be even a stand-in. So now the voters in Primorye have one Kremlin-imposed, the Kremlin candidate, and a small group of weird kind of little circus of people who are there for just, to be there, just names. And apparently the hope, Moscow's hope, is that people would have nothing, really, they just have to vote for the right person. But it's still unclear, actually, because he is so unpopular, and people in Primorsky Krai are so sort of bent on proving the point that it's unclear. It's likely that the Kremlin will win, but it may not happen. It may not be so. So we'll see. It's soon, early December. And it's kind of an illustration of the fact that the regions are different. And the Far East, the Primorsky Krai with Vladivostok, is a place where people are very active economically. They do lots of businesses. They kind of have lots of small businesses, medium businesses, and they are proud of being economically active. That's what they say themselves. And they see Moscow as a kind of a colonial, almost a colonial power, some very, very far away. You can imagine. I mean, being right now here from this country, from your country, Vladivostok is almost on the other side of the globe, and it's almost as far from Moscow. So it's like really, really far. And people say that we know better and how to rule out our. So this is like it's still very. It's not an uprising by any means. It's just and it's just people are trying to kind of prove a point. Let us, give us a bigger say in things. It's not like a big deal, just basically our local matters. We're not talking about any like big politics. It's just, we know how to govern our little place here. It's like really, really hard to do that from Moscow, which is on the other side of the globe. And to conclude, to wrap up, I would just say that it seems that for the past years, we have this growing gap between Moscow and non-Moscow, as it were. Moscow is a highly developed, diverse place, and it's packed with people. And just one statistic, domestic migration in Russia, movements within Russia, more than 50% of all migration is to Moscow. So it's like, it works like a whirlpool, and like everything goes to Moscow and everybody. And money, resources, talent, and so this creates a certain economic, political, social reality in Moscow. But then there is this big country, this using Professor Zubarevich's metaphor, this dinosaur that has different, limbs and parts, and different interests and aspirations. And there is, I would argue, a growing kind of disagreement and misunderstanding and mistrust between these diverse and different regions, and Moscow that seems to be seems to believe that its political machine and its system of rule is perfect, is like working like super well, and it's like the center of civilization in a way. And this is what they say. They say as much. The political managers, campaign managers from Moscow say this essentially, that we Moscow, we bring enlightenment, order to these unruly places, kind of underdeveloped. So they should be grateful. We bring them, money, invest in them. And the regions say, okay, that's very nice, but you know what? If you give us more of our taxes back, we could, be a part of it too, of part of the decision-making process too. And it doesn't mean, God forbid, any separatism, which is, like a forbidden word in Russia. But no, it's just being playing a more active role in our own rule and in our own life. And Moscow doesn't seem to think so. Like seriously, the people who rule from the Kremlin. So this is kind of the tension and the situation that we have now. And I think it seems like it will be a developing story for quite a long time. Thank you very much.
Yes, we still have about 15 minutes, so I have prepared a couple of questions, and we will also see if we can open the floor the last couple of minutes. Just to pick up where you left, Maxim, you described this growing mistrust between the regions and Moscow. Will this be a threat to the system? And if yes, in what scale, and what can the consequences be?
Well, it doesn't seem like I really don't want this to sound like it's a crisis or something. It's a developing story. And the Kremlin's political machine is actually a functioning, a well-working mechanism to this day. So but I just think that it's existed for a long time, and it seems that Moscow is overconfident in a way. The regime is an old regime by now, 20 years almost, and since then there's a whole new generation that grew up in all of those regions, and there are lots of people there who think that they simply don't want to leave from Moscow. Basically, very often, especially for the younger people, the choice is it, I don't know, Moscow, St. Petersburg, or someplace Europe, which is increasingly difficult and hard, and far east, of course, it's Japan or China. But it's increasingly difficult with all the sanctions and things. So essentially, it's more like Moscow or St. Petersburg. I don't know, if you live somewhere on the Lake Baikal, so what do you do? But there are more increasingly people there in the regions who say that why Moscow or St. Petersburg? We want to try and live here, build our careers and lives here, and this is something that's, I think, developing. And Moscow seems to have this conception of development that is based on highly developed cities, and like everything like over-concentrated. Moscow is like over-concentrated, like over-concentrated, everything. So, let's create a number of other centers throughout Russia that would play Moscow's role for these parts of the country. And I think there is a growing disagreement, I would say, outside of Moscow with this conception of development.
Thank you. And Ekaterina, you describe very powerful account of the young generation in North Caucasus. You say there's some kind of optimism, but at the same time you use this expression, readiness of death, which is very strong. Could you please help us and see where this is going? Which side will win? Will this be this young generation that is mistrusting the adult generation, ready for death, and versus this optimism and protesters? What do you think?
Well, there are many possible paths to develop, and readiness for death is something that is more characteristic of some parts of youth, and particularly in Chechnya, that one I was talking about, Chechnya. This was the context when I explained this. And I think it's very much depends on how the country is going to develop, including in its youth policies, right? If the government continues feeding them with patriotism, too much of, we were talking about ideology today, there is nearly an official ideology in schools, which is called patriotism, which often has the military patriotic overtone, when kids are offered all kinds of semi-military activities, drills, patriotic projects like searchers when they would go and excavate remnants of the Second World War, very formal types of events aimed at countering radicalization, which on the contrary actually is ineffective and sometimes counterproductive because they resent against it. So if this is going to be a continued pathway, I think it will end up in some kind of rebellion at some point. We don't know which shape, we don't know which form, but the way, unfortunately, Chechnya is run now makes some kind of conflict nearly inevitable at the point when the control is loosened. In other republics, I think there's much more hope, and the fact that young people do have still certain channels of self-realization contributes to this hope. So it's very open. It's not, path predetermined, and we just have to see how the country develops.
Are there any questions from the floor? Yeah, a couple. Just start in the back and move.
Julie Wilhelmsen, Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. Thank you very much for your talks and your, in a way, heartbreaking talk, Katja. And I have a question on the Kadyrov-Putin pact. Because a couple of years ago, it was obvious that so Moscow is dependent on this pact. And Putin heeds it, and every time he's asked a question, he kind of puts his hand over Kadyrov, saying, "Yeah, he's a hothead, but he's our guy. He's doing the job." But then there was quite some concern in the Russian elite, maybe particularly in Moscow, that this isn't actually, this is beyond what we can accept to keep our hand over Kadyrov in this way. So what happened to that story? Is there still any discontent with the Kadyrov in Moscow?
We'll have one more. Helge. Yeah.
Helge Bakkesrud from the same institute as Julie. I would like to ask a question to Maxim. Returning to the regional elections, during your first panel, you talked about how people were parachuted in, the Kremlin making the decision, and it's basically a local referenda where you're supposed to vote yes to the Kremlin's candidate. And then we got these 4 surprise results this time around. And you seem to explain it partly with regional resistance, or people actually being pushing the regional agenda. We've also seen it explained as related to the pensions reform and popular dissatisfaction with the pension reform. But do you see this as a blip, if it's related to the pension reform, or is it the beginning of a more long-term regional mobilization where people will not be willing to just accept whatever the Kremlin offers them, but where the Kremlin actually has to offer more in order to keep people satisfied and voting for them?
And just pass it to the front. Yeah.
Yeah, my name is Jørn Holm-Hansen from Oslo Metropolitan University. I got one question to Ekaterina. Thank you for the interesting, informative lecture. You mentioned that Chechnya is partly pursuing its own foreign policy. It would be interesting to learn more about that.
On the Kadyrov, thank you for your questions. On the Kadyrov-Putin pact, well, Kadyrov's enemies in Moscow, right? Well, Kadyrov still has lots of powerful enemies in the Russian establishment, in the security services, in the Ministry of Defense. He probably has more enemies than friends in Moscow, but he has one very powerful friend, which is Vladimir Putin, and he decides his fate. When I said that Kadyrov depends on Putin, it's the most literal type of dependence that you can find, biological survival. His own and of his numerous relatives who are and friends who are in power, because he has lots of enemies domestically. There is still the institution of blood feud in Chechnya, and he has lots of blood enemies. So he has enemies in Chechnya, he has enemies among Chechens outside, and he has lots of enemies in Moscow as well. But as long as Putin thinks that this model works, and he still thinks it works, and the international geopolitical situation makes him even more a valuable asset today, because the North Caucasus now is viewed as one of the geopolitically vulnerable parts of territories in Russia. There are several, and Crimea is one of them, and North Caucasus is one of them, because I think the people in Kremlin, their logic is that once our enemies abroad, you know, one of their plans is to facilitate disintegration of Russia, and this is one of the places from where it can start. So Kadyrov still fulfills the main points of the pact, like countering terrorism, fighting with terrorism and separatism, ensuring that Chechnya is quiet, keeping the population under control, ensuring federal elections, and making institutions run, you know, like more or less efficient, well, to an extent efficiently, at least on paper. So he still fulfills this, plus he offers all kinds of other services as Ukraine and Syria. And I don't think any Putin wants to risk. He understands the high reputational risk, losses, damages that he has associated with Kadyrov. I don't think he wants international scandals like what happened last April with the gay purge in Chechnya. I don't think he needs this. He covers this, but unwillingly. Nonetheless, he still thinks that the benefits are greater than the potential risks of changing the status quo at this point of time. And the second question was about foreign policy. Well, Kadyrov, you know, he is young and he is very ambitious. And he feels that Chechnya is very small for him. He controls everything and everywhere there, and he would like to go out to Ingushetia, to Dagestan, but he can't because these are the red lines of the Kremlin. So Kremlin gives him kind of, you know, career lifts. You know, he can't be transferred to another higher position just because of his biography. It's a kind of specific biography that doesn't really fit the federal structure, even if it's a flexible structure, but nonetheless. But being a Russian diplomat in the Middle East, for example, is one of this career growth. And I think the Kremlin quite skillfully uses, which is good, that every country should do it, regional Islamic leaders to establish relations with the countries in the Middle East. And Kadyrov has been very active recently there. He travels very often to Middle Eastern countries. He has personal relations with some of the heads of state, like Jordan is nearly his second home. And of course, these are controlled relations, and they are still very much organized by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and monitored by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But in these years, Kadyrov has built already quite a critical amount of his personal relations and ties with countries, with leaders of different countries, and he's growing his muscle as an international player as well, both on the Islamic agenda and in the interstate relations, mostly in the Middle East, of course.
Yeah, good. Maxim, then you can wrap it up with your answer.
An honest answer is that I don't know whether it's a blip or not, but it seems that it's not like also, it doesn't seem like an accident. Yes, I just didn't want to go into this pension reform. It's a complicated story, but yes, it was part of the reason why people reacted. But essentially, pension reform was hated. Pension reform is increasing the age of retirement in Russia. That's what it is, and everyone in Russia hated it. But only 4 regions essentially voted expressly against it by voting down their respective Kremlin candidates in each of the 4 of these regions. And I think it has to do not just with the retirement age change, but with the fact that people hated also the taxes, the tax on self-employed, which is a very important tax. And Russia is increasingly a place where you have lots of small businesses that exist completely outside of the state in a way. So it's like completely outside of the view of the tax inspector and everything. It's an economy that is partly natural exchange and partly just cash, and people are really fond of it. It's the way of life in many regions, especially those regions that are relatively poor, middle income to low income regions. And for them, this attempt by the state to try and tax them is very irritating. It's like something that they like truly hate. And it has nothing to do with the kind of ideology, politics, or anything. If you ask them, they would say that we love, patriotism, empire, everything. But we hate the taxing. We hate the state is trying to put its nose into our own affairs. And I think this actually has to do with this. This is the main reason, because for the past years, especially after when the income started to go down in Russia, by now it's 4 years. 4 years, it's an important statistic. 4 years of steady decline in people's incomes. And it doesn't look promising. The economic picture does not look promising. Even the economic experts from the Kremlin, within the system, central bank, they do not expect Russia's GDP to grow for more than 2% a year. And this is like the high optimistic mark. So it doesn't seem like. So people understand this. And their own life, their own sort of outside of the state kind of economy, I'm wrapping up, is their lifeline. And I think this is the nerve, this is the center of this whole story, because it's not like politics, but it's essentially people's lives the way they understand them.
Well, thank you so much for giving us an insight to a little bit what's going on outside Moscow. Help me